Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow stepped into the chapel like a ghost draped in white, her footsteps soundless and her gaze hollow, as if her soul had long since escaped her body and all that remained was the fragile shell of a woman undone by betrayal. The pristine wedding gown clung to her like a shroud, no longer a symbol of purity or new beginnings, but a cruel echo of dreams lost to ruin. Each step she took toward the altar was heavy with silent resignation, not toward a promise of eternal love, but toward the burial of something sacred that had already died inside her. Drew stood at the altar, smiling with naive certainty, unaware that the woman approaching him no longer loved him, no longer even recognized the man who once made her believe in healing. Nina's confession had shattered the final piece of Willow's foundation. She was not just betrayed as a lover, but gutted as a daughter and destroyed as a mother. Nina's affair with Drew was a knife driven deep into Willow's spine, but the deeper wound came from the knowledge that Nina, while trying to protect her own child, had helped erase Willow's bond with hers. At that moment, standing beneath the stained glass light, Willow realized she had nothing left to protect, nothing left to defend, and worst of all, no strength left to pretend. What emerged was not a bride ready to pledge her life, but a puppet dancing the final movement of a tragic performance. The music played, but there was no joy in its chords, only the cruel echo of inevitability. After the farce of the ceremony faded and guests shuffled out with puzzled glances and stifled whispers, Willow slipped away and sought the one person who had once known the real her, Michael. But this time she came not with arguments or pride, but with desperation staining her every breath. She admitted everything. She had left Drew. She had seen through his charm to the manipulator beneath. She asked for no rights, made no demands. All she wanted, no, begged for, was the chance to look into Wiley and Amelia's eyes again, to feel the warmth of her children if only for a moment, to remember what it was like to be whole, even if it was only an illusion. Michael was torn. He had every reason to shut the door. Willow's instability, her recent erratic behavior, her silence about the Daisy incident, all pointed to someone unfit to be near his children. The threat that Drew could expose everything loomed large, and Michael, ever the cautious protector, couldn't ignore the risks. Yet, something in Willow's expression, the brokenness, the raw sincerity, broke through his defenses. She wasn't the same woman who once defied him in Drew's arms. She was someone bruised by truth, someone stripped down to her very essence. And yet, the danger remained. If Drew chose to reveal what Willow had done to Daisy, tracking, intimidating, forcing her to flee, everything could unravel. Not just her chance at reconciliation, but her very freedom. Michael knew that allowing her back into the children's lives could open wounds not yet healed, that her presence could stir chaos instead of calm. What Michael didn't yet understand was that Drew, too, was crumbling behind closed doors. The mask of poise and control was slipping. He had believed he could orchestrate every detail of this romance-turned union, believed his charm and reputation would secure his place. But Willow had pierced through the illusion, had seen the opportunist in him, the man willing to gamble love, trust, and innocence to preserve his dominance. When Drew realized Willow had gone to Michael, panic brewed beneath the surface. He held a weapon, the truth about Daisy, but wielding it meant destroying what little remained of the woman he once claimed to love. And beneath that calculation, Drew felt something else, shame. A flicker of guilt. A whisper of humanity he hadn't anticipated. Because if he destroyed Willow to save himself, he wouldn't just lose her, he'd lose the last trace of conscience still pulsing inside him. Elsewhere, Nina was spiraling. The confrontation with Willow in the bridal suite had been a miscalculated gamble. Nina had dared to hope for understanding, had believed that a confession might redeem her. But Willow's icy rage, her unwavering disgust, was a mirror reflecting every selfish act Nina had ever committed. She hadn't just betrayed a daughter, she had helped rob her of motherhood. Willow's fury cut deeper than any slap, and her final push was not just physical, but metaphorical. A shove that hurled Nina out of Willow's life for good. Liesel, trying to comfort her, could offer only hollow words, her own eyes laced with doubt. For even she could no longer defend the choices Nina had made, the pain she had inflicted, all in the name of preserving her own secrets. As Nina prepared to flee Port Charles in shame, she had no idea the fire she'd started was spreading, and that it would soon burn down everything in its path. Meanwhile, at Metro Court, Christina watched the budding tension between Cody and Molly with wary unease. Every flirtatious glance, every accidental touch sent waves of discomfort through her. In Molly, she saw a version of herself, vulnerable, unsure, stepping blindly toward a man whose intentions were still cloaked in mystery. And while Michael played along in Christina's scheme to distract Cody, he remained unaware that his own world was shifting behind him. Unaware that Willow, frail and remorseful, now stood once again at the threshold of his home, not as a mother demanding her place, but as a fallen angel begging for grace. The contrast between these parallel stories, of Willow's downfall, Drew's silent collapse, and Nina's emotional exile, revealed the crumbling core of a family built on half-truths and fragile alliances. Nothing in Port Charles was what it seemed. The walls of the chapel still echoed with vows never meant, while behind the scenes, every character grappled with the realization that the damage they'd caused might never be undone. Willow, once a symbol of resilience, now faced the possibility of losing everything, even the right to mourn what had been taken from her. Michael, torn between fatherly instinct and the fragments of past love, stood at a crossroads that could redefine the future for both his children and the woman who had once called them hers. Drew, haunted by his own ambition and guilt, teetered on the edge of exposure, knowing that one wrong move could cost him everything. And Nina had finally faced the truth she'd long denied, that control is not love, and secrets cannot be buried without consequence. In her attempt to protect what she cherished, she had destroyed the very foundation she'd hoped to build. Now, left alone, rejected, and stripped of any maternal claim, she had become the architect of her own tragedy. The days ahead would offer no easy resolutions. Each decision would tighten the noose around the necks of those who once believed love could forgive anything. But in Port Charles, forgiveness was a currency in short supply, and the debts of betrayal were always collected with interest. The chaos in Port Charles was far from over, it had merely shifted form, deepened its roots, and begun to weave its way through the city like a slow-burning fire that no one noticed until the walls were already beginning to smolder. Marco Rios, long dismissed by many as a footnote in Sonny's blood-soaked past, had returned not just as a man, but as a symbol of reckoning. He was no longer the grieving, disillusioned figure he once was. Time had not healed Marco. It had sharpened him, tempered his silence into something far more lethal than fury. He had learned the art of biding his time, of watching from the margins, and now he stood firm in Port Charles with no intention of leaving. When Sonny confronted Marco and ordered him to return to Miami, it wasn't the usual power play of intimidation and bravado. Sonny, though still cloaked in the illusion of authority, was beginning to realize that Marco had become someone he could no longer easily dismiss. The conversation between them, cloaked in menace and old pain, was not just an exchange of threats, it was a resurrection of buried trauma. The death of Natalia hung between them like a phantom, her memory now weaponized. Marco didn't accuse Sonny outright. He didn't need to. Every word he chose not to say was a razor to Sonny's psyche. Sonny, ever the survivor, responded with half-veiled warnings and appeals to logic, but Marco stood his ground with a quiet certainty that spoke of deeper intentions. This was no longer about revenge, it was about exposure. And Sonny, for all his swagger and influence, felt the ground begin to quake beneath him. His empire had been built on secrets, but Marco was a man who knew too many of them. He had seen what Sonny had done, had lived through the aftermath, and now he was positioning himself in the heart of Sonny's world like a dormant volcano threatening to erupt. For Sonny, this was not just about silencing a witness, it was about maintaining the illusion of control, about suppressing a truth that could splinter everything he had rebuilt in the wake of countless tragedies. Yet, it wasn't just Marco who posed a threat. Lucas, Sonny's former brother-in-law, was relentless in his pursuit of justice. For years, he had watched Sonny escape the consequences of his choices, had seen him shielded by power, family, and the very system he manipulated. Lucas's rage wasn't theatrical, it was personal. Natalia's death was more than a statistic on Sonny's record of collateral damage, it was a wound that Lucas had carried silently, and now, with Marco's return, that wound was beginning to bleed anew. Lucas demanded accountability, not in whispers or backroom ultimatums, but in open defiance. He wanted Sonny to answer for his sins, to be dragged into the light he had avoided for so long. But Marco, who had the power to do just that, chose silence. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. His silence spoke louder than any confession ever could, and that restraint drove Lucas deeper into frustration. Trapped between these two men, Carly found herself adrift. For so long, she had mastered the art of maneuvering through Sonny's storms, had positioned herself as the voice of reason, the keeper of order in a world of chaos. But this time, the chaos was of a different nature. Marco's presence was not just a threat to Sonny, it was a threat to every lie Carly had ever helped conceal. She had stood beside Sonny for decades, defended him, loved him, and made peace with the darker corners of his soul. But now, standing in the eye of a storm she couldn't control, Carly began to feel the weight of every unspoken truth she had swallowed for the sake of family. The guilt, once buried under duty and survival, began to surface. And as if that weren't enough, back at the church, the symbolic center of what was supposed to be a celebration of love and union had become a mausoleum of illusion. Willow had vanished, and in her place, Drew stood alone, bewildered, abandoned, humiliated. The smile he had worn so confidently when she entered in her bridal gown now appeared grotesque in its ignorance. He hadn't seen it coming, hadn't realized that the woman walking toward him was not his partner, but his executioner. The ceremony had collapsed into an unspoken revelation: love built on deception will always crumble, no matter how ornate the setting or how rehearsed the vows. Guests murmured in confusion as they exited the chapel, unsure whether to call it a wedding or a catastrophe. But Ava, ever the astute observer, saw what no one else did. Beneath the formal wear, the floral arrangements, and the forced smiles, she saw the structure of power beginning to fracture. She sensed that the collapse of this wedding was only the first domino. Something was coming, something big, something uncontainable. She could feel it in the way Drew refused to speak, in the way Carly's hands trembled when she picked up her phone, in the silence Marco carried like a loaded gun. Secrets were stirring, alliances were shifting, and the fault lines beneath Port Charles were beginning to crack. What Ava understood, and what others would soon discover, was that every choice, every betrayal, every omission of truth had consequences. The truth about Natalia. The lies Drew told Willow. The manipulations Nina carried out under the guise of maternal protection. The lines between heroes and villains were no longer clear, and in a town like Port Charles, that ambiguity was a breeding ground for war. Marco's presence was a signal, a ticking clock. He wasn't just there for answers. He was there for transformation. Sonny, Lucas, Carly, even Willow and Drew, they were all players in a game whose rules were about to change. And Marco? Marco was the piece everyone had forgotten they'd placed on the board, now returning to turn the table upside down. In the days to come, there would be tears, accusations, and more betrayals. But beneath it all, there would be one constant: the truth, long buried, was clawing its way to the surface. And no one, no matter how powerful or protected, would escape its reach. Willow was no longer the fragile woman shattered by loss. She had become the embodiment of something far more profound and enduring, the calm after devastation, the eye of a storm forged by betrayal, abandonment, and sacrifice. She had been many things throughout her journey in Port Charles: a caregiver, a lover, a mother, a daughter. She had loved deeply, given selflessly, and believed, perhaps naively, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But now, every illusion had been stripped from her, every comforting lie torn away. The woman who stood in the aftermath of that brutal truth was not weak or broken. She was raw, elemental, and unafraid. She had endured the loss of her child, the collapse of a future she believed in, and the betrayal of those she trusted most. And from that pain, she did not wither, she evolved. Her decision to seek out Michael was not born of hope but of necessity. It was not a return to the past but a confrontation with it. She knew that she no longer had the luxury of being perceived as innocent or deserving. The mistakes she made, the alliances she clung to, the blindness she chose, had cost her dearly. But there was one truth she still held onto with fierce tenacity, her love for Wiley and Amelia. That love was not tethered to custody papers or court rulings. It was something sacred, enduring, and above all else, redeemable. Her plea to Michael was not a demand for rights, but a recognition that the road to restoration would be long and painful, paved not with entitlement but with humility. Michael, however, was not easily swayed. He had become a protector above all else, guarding his children not only from external threats but from emotional chaos. He had watched Port Charles devour people whole, one lie, one betrayal at a time. He had lived through the trauma of losing family to violence, to manipulation, to secrets, and he had sworn his children would be shielded from that legacy. Letting Willow back in, even partially, was not just a risk to his children's stability. It was a risk to his own carefully curated equilibrium. He had already buried the version of himself that loved Willow unconditionally. To allow her back in now, even just as a visitor, would mean reopening wounds he had tried to seal shut. But Willow wasn't asking for comfort. She wasn't even asking for forgiveness. She stood before him not as the woman he once loved, but as someone forged by grief and tempered by loss. Her vulnerability was unmistakable, but so was her strength. She didn't cry. She didn't bargain. She simply spoke her truth, that she had walked away from Drew, that she had seen the damage her silence had caused, and that she was ready to begin again, however painful that beginning might be. And in that moment, Michael saw something he hadn't expected, not weakness, but resolve. Still, the shadow of Drew loomed. Michael knew what Drew was capable of, his ability to manipulate, to conceal, to protect his own interests with the same cold calculation Sonny once employed. If Drew decided to expose Willow's actions regarding Daisy, it would be catastrophic. Willow's fragile foothold on redemption would be obliterated. The legal system would crucify her. The public would condemn her. And worst of all, Wiley and Amelia would grow up believing their mother was a danger, not a protector. But Drew hadn't made that move yet, and Michael began to wonder why. Was it guilt? Remorse? Or something more strategic? The uncertainty made Michael's decision even more agonizing. He stood between two precipices, one that risked exposing his children to instability and one that risked hardening them against the possibility of forgiveness. In a city like Port Charles, where morality was a sliding scale and everyone wore masks, this choice wasn't just about co-parenting. It was about identity. About legacy. About whether a man could balance justice and compassion without compromising both. If he denied Willow's request, he might sleep easier knowing his children were protected. But he might also live with the knowledge that he became the kind of man who couldn't see past pain, who couldn't recognize genuine transformation even when it stood in front of him, stripped bare. For Willow, every breath was a battle. Every minute she spent outside the lives of her children felt like a punishment without end. She knew she had failed them, not by leaving, but by choosing silence when she should have spoken, by clinging to Drew when her heart had already told her the truth. But she also knew that redemption could not be earned in a single conversation. It would take time. She would need to prove herself not through words, but through consistency. Through restraint. Through the kind of patience only a mother who had lost everything could muster. She wasn't trying to rebuild a family. She was trying to reclaim a fragment of her soul. And she was willing to wait. If Michael needed time, she would give it. If he needed distance, she would honor it. But she would not disappear. She would not be erased. Her children would know that she never stopped loving them. That she stood in the fire and did not run. That she faced her mistakes and chose growth. And in doing so, she became the kind of woman she wished she had been all along, unyielding, honest, and deeply aware of the cost of silence. As the final days of July bled into August, the emotional temperature in Port Charles continued to rise. Secrets long buried began to stir, and the facade of peace that blanketed the town began to peel away. Willow's confrontation with Michael wasn't just a personal reckoning, it was the first tremor in what would become a city-wide earthquake. If Michael opened that door, even a crack, others would follow. The lines between the forgiven and the forsaken would blur. Drew's power over the narrative would weaken. And those who had spent years wielding control through secrets would find themselves exposed. Michael would have to ask himself what kind of legacy he wanted to leave, not just for his children, but for himself. In a city built on betrayal and guarded hearts, could he be the one to choose differently? To believe in a kind of love that didn't require perfection? Could he extend mercy not as a sign of weakness, but as a testament to his strength? These were questions that wouldn't go away, no matter how much he tried to shield himself from their implications. For now, the choice lingered like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. Willow had said her piece. Michael had listened. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, a door creaked open, not all the way, not yet. But enough. Enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. Not immediate. Not simple. But real.